Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery and we're going to be tending to my 140-day-old bin today. It was 10 days ago today when the bin reached its 130th day of age that we had taken all of the contents of the bin, slid them over to the side to make a nice opening on the edge, and on that edge we had created ourselves a nice fresh environment for the worms, fresh bedding, fresh food. And the whole idea behind that was to lure the worms out of the finished compost into that new zone so that we can start scooping them out of here and get them relocated into a different bin, and eventually hoping for the depopulation of the castings in here so we can harvest them. So it just so happens that I've got two bins that are in the same boat as this right now. And the other bin that I'm working on down there on the bottom also had a fair number of worms removed from it 2 days ago. It too is undergoing a horizontal migration, as I refer to it, trying to depopulate the castings. And I've got a new bin down here. This bin just started 2 days ago with the launch of the worms that were extracted from that other bin. So into this same new bin of mine, only 2 days old, is where we're going to be putting our collected worms once we gather them together. So let's start out by scooping out the worms that we've collected in here. We'll set them aside briefly as we rebuild the feeding zone in here so that it can continue, and then we'll go ahead and we'll release the worms down into this new bin. All right, so let's get going. So the worms that we gather as part of this process, we can place into this plastic tray that I've got over here. And the feeding zone that we had set up is underneath this plastic. The plastic is intended to help the moisture in the bin continue to recirculate rather than allowing it to vaporize and evaporate. On this side we're using a very thin piece of paper, just a sheet of newspaper, in the hopes that just the opposite will happen, in the hopes that the moisture on this side will have a chance to lift up out of the material and evaporate into the air, leaving slightly drier castings behind. So over here is where our attention should be. Let's make sure we don't take any worms with us. We did create a pretty nice sized feeding zone over here, and I don't know what to expect. Hopefully we'll be able to reclaim some of this bedding material, some of this stuff that's making this up over here, so that we can rebuild this when we're finished. Before we go picking around in here though, I'm just tempted to see how our depopulation efforts after 10 days are progressing. Right away I'm already seeing a number of worms popping up with the material, and the material has a very high moisture level to it, a little bit muddy almost. So I think it wouldn't hurt for the material to get fluffed up just a little bit, get some air pockets down in there. I believe if we can kind of stir this up a bit, get the really moist stuff up from the bottom, allow some of the stuff that has already had a chance to dry off the top surface go down lower, get combined with one another, and then the stuff might have a chance at drying out a little bit more quickly. I guess the other thing that we could do is maybe just leave the newspaper covering this material and leave only that covering the material. Everywhere we look, there's plenty of worms everywhere within the material. And the material is all very hospitable from a worm's perspective. It's all nice and damp. It still has little scraps of food in it here and there. And by that I just mean these little sticks and stems. I guess I had made the decision to allow those sticks and stems to gradually break down as the worms continue to inhabit this material before they hopefully evacuate as part of the migration. I guess I'm also risking the possibility of having a fair number of these little sticks and stems remain in my compost too, which is not the end of the world either. Very nice material, but definitely a little more moist than it needs to be. So hopefully this aeration will help a little bit. Hopefully also by creating little openings throughout the material by airing it out this way, we give the worms a little bit more mobility to pass through the material, just in case they can maybe already sense the food supply over in the feeding zone and just are having a hard time getting over there, pushing through the damp material. Yeah, plenty of worms in here to be depopulated. So this will definitely have to continue for a little while longer. I wonder how much longer it'll take before this material really starts to become worm-free. So we'll return this piece of paper to cover up the material so we can rest this tray on top of it. And let's start extracting worms. This piece of paper is doing pretty good. We'll keep it in the same function, covering up what's happening over here. Let's see what's in the middle here. Nothing. Good. Very fragile. I just touch it and it starts tearing away. Other stuff that I hope we can repurpose is a lot of this bedding material that's here on top. So we'll rest this aside too. Now, as I'm getting a better look at our feeding zone over here, it seems like it's not really the party that I had hoped it would be. Well, maybe it is. Maybe we just haven't gotten down deep enough to see what's happening. But the hope here is still that we're going to have a fair number of worms that have made their way into this material so that we can extract them. So I'm going to try to separate this stuff away from these 2 sheets of cardboard that we're attempting to partition the finished compost material from this new feeding zone. The cardboard is riddled with holes to allow passage through, but it's certainly not a huge deterrent. The worms can go under it. They can do whatever they want. Alright, yeah, now I'm remembering what we did here. It's coming back to me. We had placed in some of these cardboard egg trays into which we had placed some of our baiting food and other things. So we've got a whole bunch of cardboard here, not very populated with worms, a little bit matted together. It almost seems like they may have actually come in here and consumed whatever food was in these trays and left. Because here and there is just a little bit of material, maybe a worm or two in each of these trays, but they're, for the most part, they're just empty at this point. So I wonder if waiting 10 days may have been a little bit too long. Maybe they just came in here, took advantage of whatever food they were able to find, and maybe they skedaddled. It's like here, it almost seems like I'm not even... Oh, see, I spoke too soon. I thought I wasn't really coming across anything, but, you know, right there within that one little cell of the tray, you've got a whole boatload of worms congregating. They're right there inside that little pocket of the tray. It almost seemed like the tray was desolate of any creatures, but once I poked down into it, I was starting to immediately see that I was wrong. Let's see what we do if we poke down into this one. Ah, okay, that's interesting. Here's my my little wad of hair from my own self-haircut. That tray, this cell of this tray had nothing else in there than or this ball of hair. People have commented, since they saw me put this in here last time, that it will take a huge amount of time for that to get broken down by the worms, so certainly nothing to hold our breath for. Some of these openings in this tray are pretty busy, like this one here. A fair number of worms hanging out in it. And then the one right next to it has nothing. So I'm not sure what the difference is. I definitely see the bedding and some of the coffee that was placed into these last time, but I don't remember what the food was, but there doesn't seem to be many signs of it as far as like food scraps in here. Let's do something that I like to do. I just sort of want to take this entire contents here wholesale as it is and just pull it out. So we have it in this tray here. So let's begin by lifting what we can straight out and dumping it in here temporarily, I believe, because a lot of it I think is just going to be able to go right back in. But we do want to extract as many worms as we possibly can here. That is our goal. I believe we've got a fair number of them in here. If you go down low, they're definitely coming over for the food. And they're definitely congregating in the normal place where you'd expect them to be, which is down low, which is where all the moisture tends to sink down to. So now, what I intend to do here is just give this tray a little bit of time out here in the bright light for the worms to start retreating down into the material. And then slowly I think we'll be able to just start skimming a lot of this material off that we could use to rebuild our feeding zone over here. But just to start, I'm going to put in a fresh layer of leaves here. I don't want to go too overboard. So I do think that there's a fair amount of stuff remaining here from previously. As far as these trays are concerned, I don't know if they're helping us or hindering us, because this wholesale removal of material from the feeding zone approach does get hampered by these things, you know. I mean, this stuff is ultimately intended to be bedding material for the worms. So it's all edible. It's just cardboard. I just don't know how long the material is going to last. So just for consistency's sake, I guess we'll stick with it. We're going to put them right back where they were, and I think that's the same place where the hair had been previously. But yeah, that's the reason I put a piece of eggshell under it, just in case by chance the worms were to gobble all that hair up suddenly. I would know that that's where it was because the eggshell is in there. I think before we start piling in some of this older bedding material that we scooped out, I think we're going to place in a handful or two of fresh food into the feeding zone. So I bought down a bag of frozen items from the refrigerator that we can use to stock up the feeding zone again. Here's a nice piece of cantaloupe we'll place right in the middle. And we have a variety of different stuff like banana peels and mangoes and vegetable cuttings, which we can scatter throughout this feeding zone. Here too, we've still got some other food scraps rolling over. That's a banana stem. Lots of sticks and stems with the leafy material here too. I think I'm going to try to make sure that this stuff on top is nice and fluffed up so any worms that might be in it have a chance to retreat rather than being stuck between a couple layers of things. It's quite an intermingled collection of stuff. I think a good final step will be to just let this sit out here in the bright light for a minute or two. And I believe that the worms will all make their way right down to the very, very bottom, hopefully. And then that would permit me to much more easily skim off this stuff off the top without much concern of there being worms scattered throughout it. So that's what I'm going to do here now. I'm just going to let this sit for a couple minutes. I'll take a break. And then hopefully within a few minutes I'll be able to much more easily skim just uncomposted food items and bedding materials off the top of this here as the worms dive down. So let's give these guys a little chance to dive. Well, I bought some lamps a little bit closer down to make the scene a bit brighter for the worms, to motivate them to head on down. So I don't want to make too much of a process out of this. This is already taking a little bit more time than I thought that it would. I guess the feeding zone may not have been as optimal as it could have been for the purposes of trying to round up worms for easy extraction. Those little trays that I put in there to see how things break down. I mean, it's nice that I've got an opportunity to break down those cardboard egg cartons. So that's the reason I had placed them back into our feeding zone, just to let them continue getting broken down. But they're not the most practical thing, especially if what you're hoping to do is just sort of, wholesale extract a feeding zone, having all these larger objects holding other objects in the way. There's a little bit of an impedance. But then again, we're not really doing things in this bin with maximum efficiency in mind. A lot of times we sacrifice efficiency for, I guess, just for satisfying our curiosity, just for doing a little testing, a little bit of experimentation. It's a little bit of fun in the worm bin. Why not, right? Now I did do an extraction out of a very, very, very heavily populated bin, as I mentioned earlier, 2 days ago. And I also just have to be careful not to try to get my expectations set a little bit too high, because it wasn't very surprising that the feeding zone in that bin had yielded a huge number of worms when I did the extraction. Quite possibly twice as many as I'm seeing here. But I still think we're doing great here. We got a good large number of worms to make their way out of our material, out of the compost, enabling us to relocate them. So we should have fun releasing these little guys into their new home. And I don't think we need to go too crazy at this point trying to pick through this material. Maybe before we release these guys, we'll even put them on the scale and get a quick read on their overall weight. And then naturally we'll have to factor in the obvious, which is this is not purely worms, and they're also sitting inside of a tray that has some weight to it. So why don't we see what we ended up with here really quick, and then we'll go ahead and we'll release them into their new space. But before we could do that, let's just cover up here and get this tray back up on the shelf. For now, we've got a rebuilt migration feeding zone, much the same as it was last time we came in here to set it up originally. But like we said earlier, I think there's going to be a little bit of a benefit to not covering this bin up with the cardboard that was covering the entire top. So I think we'll go so far as restoring this piece of bubble wrap that was retaining the moisture over the feeding zone. We'll put that right back where we found it. The rest of the material will be left with more of an opportunity to air dry and to evaporate by not being covered up. All right, let's go get the bin that we're going to release our worms into. But before we do, we're going to get our trusty little scale out here on the bench. Try to position in a way that the glare coming off the lights overhead is not too severe. And we'll just get a quick read on the weight of this haul. It's not even a half a pound, and we've still got to deduct the number of ounces to account for this material that the worms are squirming down into in the plastic tray itself. So I believe got a worm on the outside. We want to try to save them. So I don't know what to say, 1/4 pound at least, probably more. Should be fun to release them. Let's go get the new tray that they're going to be cut loose in. Wow. I'm always so surprised when I grab one of my newest bins. It has like virtually no weight to it. It's super light. We've got So far, what we had estimated to be about 1,000 worms already occupying this bin. You can see a lot of them have come up to the surface, probably in pursuit of the moisture collecting underneath the plastic that I have in my hand. As we do usually, we place this coffee filter over where we last fed them. So we're not feeding them now, but we will return that piece of coffee filter to where we found it after we finish releasing the worms. You can see how well these bright lights are working. The worms that had been hanging out here a moment ago, they're all gone already. And that couldn't have been more than a minute. Luckily, they're pretty quick to react. They're quick on their feet. All right, everyone, let's make this happen. I'm going to estimate at least 500 worms in here, 500, 600 worms probably. And like I said, I believe we've already got something in the neighborhood of 1,000 worms in here already. So we'll scoop some of this junk off that they've already burrowed out of and down. Already a couple worms coming through with that. But let's let these little guys loose. Okay, I believe we've got them all. Alright, let's try to check them out really quick before they scurry down into the material. Wow, that couldn't have been more than a minute or two. Well, a couple minutes at least. So let's say 3 or 4 minutes. Those little guys squirmed right out of view in no time. So, that's that. We've got our first round of depopulation complete in our 140-day worm bin. And this bin right here is benefiting from that. And we'll continue doing it the same way. We'll leave another, I don't know, maybe another 10 days. Maybe by the time that bin is 150 days old, it'll be a little bit closer to being ready for harvest, but I doubt it. I think we'll do a haul and we'll probably find that the material is still a bit damp, still somewhat populated with worms, and we'll just continue until we reach a point where we're satisfied that the castings are, for the most part, depopulated and have dried out enough for us to be able to utilize them. And we'll take it from there. So that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up, because that's really appreciated, and also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's really appreciated too. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.